And that was true. We were really getting paid to watch couples deteriorate and making a living at it. And so we really did a series of research studies trying to look at the masters of relationships, the ones, you know, who really stayed together, didn't get divorced, and were pretty happy, more or less. And the disasters of relationships, the ones that broke apart, and the ones that stayed together and were unhappy as well. And we really were able to study couples across the whole life course. In fact, we're just completing a study in the Bay Area now that we started 20 years ago with two groups of couples, a group of couples in their 40s and a group of couples in their 60s. And our oldest subjects are now in their late 80s. So we're just finishing this. And across the whole life course, we've looked at transitions to becoming parents, what happens when a baby arrives in the relationship, how does it affect the relationship, how do relationships affect babies, can we predict anything about child development, and we found to our great surprise that we could predict, as we followed couples over many, many years, with over 90% accuracy, what would happen to a marriage. Even from the first 3 minutes of a conflict discussion a couple is having, we can predict 96% of the time how the entire conversation will go. And from the conversation, we can predict with high accuracy whether a couple will get divorced or not, how happy they'll be. And in fact, one of my graduate students, Allison Shapiro, who studied couples in the last trimester of pregnancy, was able to predict the child's temperament and the child's neurological development and reduce 50% of the uncertainty in looking at the first 3 years of the baby's life, just by looking at how the parents argued in the last trimester. So I want to take you through knowing our 35 years of research, in which our first question was, could we find any patterns that discriminated the masters from the disasters of relationships? And second, what theory could we develop to understand those patterns? And only when we developed that theory were we able to design interventions to help people. And so these are all scientifically based interventions. What discriminated the disasters from the masters of relationships was that the masters were really very gentle with one another, even when they raised an issue. They raised it as if it was kind of an invisible soccer ball that they were kicking around together. They took responsibility for even a small part of the problem. Whereas the disasters really pointed their finger at their partner and were critical, and their attitude was that they were kind of diagnosing their partner's personality defects. And they wanted to be really appreciated for that by their partner. And they were hoping that their partner would respond by saying, "Thank you for pointing out all the ways in which I am failing as a human being. Can we have lunch next Tuesday so we can talk about this some more? You are such a wise person, John. You know, thank you so much." Unfortunately, criticism, which is stating the problem in the relationship as a defect in the partner, leads to the second predictor we have of what predicts relationships' demise, which is defensiveness. And defensiveness is any way of warding off a perceived attack. But unfortunately, the masters do the opposite. They say, "Interesting. That's an interesting point. Tell me more about what you see as our problem and how I contribute to this." The disasters become defensive and say, "It's not my fault, it's your fault." And they raise something that's a counterattack rather than responding by saying, "Interesting point, tell me more." Or they whine. You know, they present themselves as an innocent victim. So we saw a pattern in the way conflicts begin. And our best predictor of relationship demise was a behavior we call contempt, which is any statement you make to your partner from a superior place. And if you think you're more punctual than your partner, more intelligent, more knowledgeable about something, or a better parent, or cleaner, or tidier, then usually what you say is really speaking down and has an air of superiority. The most common way we found was direct insults and name calling, calling people a jerk and an idiot, saying what they're saying is ridiculous. But one of my favorite ones is correcting somebody's grammar when they're angry with you. I think that's a really effective way of being contemptuous. So if my wife says, I could care less about that, I would say, hold on there, honey. It is not I could care less. It is I couldn't care less. That's the right way to say it. Now, what was your point? Okay, so it's one of my favorite ways. So contempt is our best predictor of divorce and breakup in same-sex relationships as well, and also a predictor of how many infectious illnesses in the next 4 years the recipient of contempt will get. So it's been shown that contempt is a very wide spectrum downregulator of immune functioning. The final predictor that discriminates the masters from the disasters during conflict we call stonewalling, which is basically listener withdrawal from the conflict. And the stonewaller basically doesn't give the usual cues that a listener gives, like head nodding, eye contact, brief vocalizations, yeah, and facial movement. Yeah, that could be, yeah, sure. Oh, interesting, yeah. The stonewaller is really tuned out, like a stone wall. But when we try to predict stonewalling from our data, from our stream of interaction, we found that an elevated heart rate above the intrinsic rhythm of the heart, around 100 beats a minute, predicts stonewalling. So we interviewed stonewallers about these moments in their interaction, and it turned out what they were trying to do was really calm down and not make the interaction worse. So the internal monologue of a stonewaller was something like this. Okay, just don't say anything. Let her burn herself out. How long can this last? 10 minutes to the game. She can't touch me then, you know. That was the hope, anyway, of the stonewaller. And now, did guys who are in master relationships stonewall? They did, but they were able to self-soothe physiologically. Now, so we had these basic findings that discriminated the masters from the disasters, but they didn't help us in understanding it. By putting together the data that we had, looking at couples over long periods of time, we discovered that one of the most important discriminators between the masters and disasters of relationships was the ability to repair interaction. That in fact, in all relationships, regrettable incidents and arguments that go out of control and hurting your partner's feelings are inevitable. And one of the contributions Bob and I wound up making was that we wound up studying really good relationships, and before this research, therapists really had to fantasize about what a good relationship would be like. Oprah Winfrey hasn't had one, for example, and, you know, Dr. Phil just got divorced, so, you know, we don't know, these guys don't really know what a good relationship is like from their own experience. And we were able to do that by doing research on good relationships. And every relationship experiences conflict and periods of alienation. But the difference between the masters and the disasters is they're able to repair. And so repair turns out to be really the sine qua non of relationships. Being able to say, I'm really sorry. You know, I blew it that time. You know, that didn't go very well. Can we talk about it? And what we thought was that maybe the way the repair was made would make an enormous difference. And for several years, we looked at the nature of repair, and we discovered that we were looking in the wrong place. It was really the recipient of repair that was the important person to look at. And what made the difference in repair working and being effective was the quality of the friendship in the relationship. Not looking at conflict, but looking at how people maintain friendship and intimacy and emotional connection. Is about the way people create a sense of shared meaning and purpose. Because when people start to have a committed relationship, they are really not just having a relationship with one another that's romantic, that has conflict, but they're really building a life together. A life with meaning and purpose and mission and legacy and culture and values. And unless they have the conversations they need to have that make those meanings intentional and shared, then they go through life really not building this very important existential part of their connection together. And that's pretty much everything I know about relationships. So I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.